Hi, everyone. I'm Maggie McGrath, senior editor at Forbes. Pope Francis died on Monday at the age of 88. He now rests in state in St. Peter's Basilica before his funeral, which is scheduled to happen on Saturday. After Saturday, the College of Cardinals will meet to choose his successor. There's a lot to talk about, and we are so thrilled to have our next guest with us. He is Massimo Faggioli, a professor of theology at Villanova University. Professor, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So, there is a lot that has to happen within the Catholic Church over the next few weeks, but before we dive into the procedure and the politics, I want to ask you, what will stand out the most to you about Pope Francis's legacy? Is there something that's top of mind to you that you think will endure over time?
Yes, there's one thing, and especially the fact that he was the Pope who really introduced Catholicism to the third millennium, as the first Pope who was not European, not coming from the Mediterranean area, came from the margins of the Christian world, of the European world, and he saw everything through a different lens, geographically and historically. Colonialism instead of World War II, the south of the world instead of Europe. This is something that really speaks about what Catholicism has become, and he has been the perfect Pope at this time.
The perfect Pope at this time. Did the College of Cardinals know in 2013 that he would be the perfect Pope at this time?
No, many did not, and some even expressed public regret for voting for him because they imagined something else. They imagined a slow transition after a troubled pontificate of Pope Benedict because of the scandals. They thought they had elected a Jesuit who was more conservative than the Jesuits they knew. They didn't know what they were going to get. And so that's been a pontificate full of surprises for all of us.
I ask because there's a lot of speculation about who will succeed Pope Francis. But before we get into the succession planning, so to speak, I want to ask you about the procedures and traditions that will unfold over the coming days and how they might be different with Francis than with his predecessors. Was a pope who is known for being very humble. And can you talk about how his funeral plans depart from longtime tradition?
It departs in small details in reality because Pope Francis made these decisions a few years ago that he wanted his funeral to be like the funeral of a bishop, not of a prince, not of a head of state. This is a cultural revolution within Catholicism because, according to many, the Pope is the last Roman emperor. And so Pope Francis rejected that. So he simplified the funeral, he simplified the pageantry, I mean, around the translation of his body from the house to St. Peter. And then he chose to be buried not in the Vatican, which has been the choice of many popes in these last couple of centuries, but in Santa Maria Maggiore, which is one of the papal basilicas in Rome, which is was one of his favorites, actually the favorite church in Rome for him because of the chapel of the Virgin Mary. But in the early modern period, actually was a very popular place for papal burial before the 19th century. So have been small changes in this, in the sense of a simplified, more austere, but not to save money, to send a kind of message.
Is it possible that Vatican leadership would override his wishes? I believe I was seeing something around Pope John Paul the first or the second, who had expressed some wish around his funeral, and ultimately Vatican leadership overrode that decision. Is that fact or fiction?
No, that happens sometimes also on some other details of the testament that they left, like burning papers that the Pope wanted to be burned and it didn't happen. At this time, it's more difficult that this happened because, as you said, Pope Francis has the humility of a Franciscan, but also the stubbornness of Jesuits. So he knew how to make sure that his will was respected, I think.
When you talk about the global lens that he brought to Catholicism and to the Vatican, I'd like to talk about some of the cardinals that he has appointed. The College of Cardinals will be a huge focus in the coming weeks. Can you talk about how much he has changed the shape of that college, and specifically among the people who will be voting for the next pope?
He reshaped the College of Cardinals in different ways. One is that he made it much larger. So right now there are 135 cardinals with the right to vote because they are younger than 80, well above the usual limit of 120. So that is a much larger college, which means a higher quorum of votes of the two-thirds for the Pope to be elected. Second, he diversified the college in the sense of appointing many more cardinals from the global south, from Latin America, Africa, Asia, from small cities, not major capitals, not Paris, not Berlin, for example, not major cities that traditionally had the cardinal. And third, he has appointed bishops like him, much closer to the model of a street priest who has pastoral experience, who's close to his people, often coming from very small churches. The cardinal of Mongolia, in the entire Mongolia, has fewer Catholics than in my parish in suburban Philadelphia, just to give an idea of how incredibly diverse this college is. One final problem is that it's a larger college of cardinals that don't know each other well because they haven't met often. And so I think it will take more time at this conclave for them to know each other, to have informal exchanges, because this is part of the chemistry of the conclave. So he has reshaped the college in very significant ways.
I know it's impossible to really predict how the College of Cardinals will proceed and how the vote will ultimately turn out, but knowing that he has reshaped the face of the college, how do you think that will affect the vote and these conversations? You said it'll take some time for them to talk, but could it ultimately shape the ultimate choice?
Well, it will, for sure. It's not necessary that having a more diverse college will give us a more diverse pope. I mean, coming from the south of the world. Paradoxically, the best person to carry on Pope Francis' legacy could be one of those cardinals who worked with him in the Vatican. Could be an Italian, could be a European. So we don't know that. It's very hard also because among those cardinals made by Pope Francis, their views on some divisive issues, for example, the role of women in the church or on homosexuality, are very different between a cardinal from Asia and a cardinal from North America or Africa, right? So there is no Pope Francis bloc or party, okay, that can unite them from the start. It might build an alliance, but it's subject to so many unknowns right now.
That is so interesting that you say there's no Pope Francis block, because I think when we talk about American Catholicism, or perhaps this is just my view living in the Northeast and seeing some of the sects that have emerged elsewhere in the U.S., you see those that feel very anti Pope Francis, very anti-Vatican II and the reforms those instituted. But is that a uniquely American phenomenon, and more globally, those types of divides don't quite exist the same way?
It's an American phenomenon that now threatens to spread to other countries. That's a real problem that cardinals know, right? So this is really part of the two-party system that we have in the United States, which is unique, I think, in a democracy. Certainly doesn't apply to church politics, but we know that the Catholic Church in the United States is very influential, because of its cultural power, because of its wealth. And so there are some tendencies that might actually penetrate other churches in creating sects because the new information ecosystem, the social media, the internet, favors these kind of strong feelings, okay, around a particular brand of of Catholicism. But this is still very much a U.S. syndrome, I would say.
To ask another political question, sometimes in politics we talk about the pendulum theory in elections, right? Each election can be a reaction to the one before. Does that same reactivity apply to the choosing of a new pope? Is it a little bit fair to assume that the college could look at everything Francis did and decide that was too progressive, let's swing the other way?
It's certainly possible. I think there are some cardinals who are very skeptical of what Pope Francis did. I wouldn't bet my money on another Jesuit pope, to be honest, because after one Jesuit pope, it's very unlikely that they will choose another Jesuit. But so this swinging of the pendulum is a good insight. I think that this time, this conclave happens at a very particular time in global history, where there are so many unknowns. The new imperial way of doing foreign relations, which are actually a threat against Catholicism in many countries. So I'm not convinced that we can apply that lens because it's typical of a Western way of looking at how different political cultures balance themselves, right? So it's possible, it's not a given.
It's interesting that you talk about some of the global phenomenons threatening Catholicism. And I wonder, you've talked about this a little this week, if you could talk more about the soft power of the church within a lot of hard power we see between the U.S., China, Russia, some of the major global headlines right now. How does the Vatican view its position in this global environment with all these massive conflicts and questions?
The Vatican is a very unique mix of a very ancient tradition that is religious, but it's also political, legal, and diplomatic. It's a church that it's everywhere. It has the oldest diplomatic service in the world. It has a very strong stance on rights, on democracy, on human dignity. It is very political in its own way. I mean, not partisan, but political. So it has an interest in creating better conditions for a, a dignified human life to be lived. This is a very political position to have right now. So what's new is that now we don't really know where the Western world, led by the United States, is going. Until a few years ago, we had a fairly stable idea of what the United States was. Now we are not so sure. That's a huge source of uncertainty for the cardinals around the world because if, for example, foreign aid stops coming from the United States, that impacts the churches, right? And so this is really a time of disruption of the international order. The Vatican is traditionally, especially since the early 20th century, a player who wants to have a role, especially when there are wars. And this is a very delicate moment to choose a leader that can speak on the global stage to the leader of Russia, of the United States, of China, of India. That's really a new game that the Vatican has to think about geopolitically.
Before we started recording, I asked you about some of the myths that exist around the Vatican and specifically the College of Cardinals. And you said two things. One, that the cardinals aren't as perhaps divorced from reality, and you mentioned social media a few minutes ago, as we all might expect. And you also said something about the wealth that is associated with the Vatican. Can you talk about these misconceptions as you see them?
Well, one misconception hit me when many people were surprised that when he was a bishop, Pope Francis, before becoming Pope, he was using the public transportation system, which is totally normal for most bishops in poor countries, right? And so there's this conception that being a bishop or being a cardinal automatically isolates you from reality. I mean, that sometimes happens, but now less than once, okay? Because now the church understood that the credibility relies on personal witness and how you live your life. And second, so this Dan Brown-esque idea of the Vatican like a spectre where there is unlimited money, the unlimited checkbook that can be spent on all kinds of machinations, conspiracies. It is actually a much smaller operation than a major American university. Less money, less resources. So there's a grandeur. So there's a long tradition, the arts, and so on. But it is far less powerful in terms of raw power than we usually imagine.
That's really interesting. Now, I know that predicting the next pope is a bit of a fool's errand, and as you noted at the beginning of this conversation, there were some in the college who had been surprised by what Pope Francis ultimately did in his time as pope. But I did check Polymarket because humans being humans, they like to bet on things. Pietro Parolin was somewhere around 29%, 30% in the Polymarket. Luis Antonio Tagle, the cardinal from the Philippines, was around 24%. Matteo Zuppi, I believe he's Italian, was seeing about 10% of the betting money. What do you make of the debate around some of these top candidates, and can we even call them top candidates?
So these things are fun and good to make some money. They are often wrong. So we usually start thinking about the outcome of the conclave starting from the candidates, like in the American primaries, right? So you have the conclave works differently. So the conclave starts with the agenda, right? What are we talking about here? What is the top issue that we should talk about here? When they coalesce around a certain set of issues, then the candidates come. It's a reverse process, right? And so, of course, I mean, I have in mind my own list of possible candidates, but what I'm more interested now is to understand what kind of conversations they're having, what they are saying in public, what they're not saying. But I'm knowing some of them and having followed this for a long time, that's the most interesting thing, what they are thinking about, what they're talking about, because then you can have some idea on who they might think about a possible pope.
Oh, that's interesting. We've talked about the global conflicts and the state of the world, but two other issues that I will be watching for. You mentioned women in leadership and the church's treatment of women in general. I know the study of female deacons is something that Pope Francis had begun, but those two papal commissions, to my understanding, had not concluded. And then, of course, we have the issue of sexual abuse within the church, and we have a network of survivors the Survivor Network for those abused by priests has called for the next pope to have no history of covering up sexual abuse, and they're also calling for a zero tolerance policy. Do you have any sense for how important these two issues will be to the college?
They are very important issues, there's no question about that. Incredibly important, especially the second one on sexual abuse. They know that the papacy can be destroyed by electing the wrong person. There's no question about that. So there are also other issues that are less sensational. The Vatican really needs money. It's a very serious financial crisis. So they need to find a way or to find someone who can help fix that financial situation. This is certainly part of the conversation.
What will you be looking for in the coming days and weeks? I know we have the funeral in a few days, but once the conclave starts to meet, what will you be looking for in headlines and chatter among the Catholic Church?
Especially what cardinals do not say in public. There are, I mean, the conclave is made of days of voting, okay? But there are some steps before, especially the mass for the funeral of Pope Francis and the mass that opens the conclave, the mass pro eligendo pontifice for the election of the Pope. And there are some homilies, some gestures that indicate something. This is what happened in 2005 and what happened in 2013. They said something on the orientation of the conclave. I'm going to look for those homilies, those speeches, because they suggest something.
Do you remember, was there one or two lines in 2013 that was the tell?
Yes, it was the homily by Cardinal Sodano, a very conservative cardinal, who in the homily said that this church needs a pope for reconciliation and mercy. That was close to the profile of Pope Francis. Even Pope Francis and Cardinal Sodano had very little in common, ideologically. But there was a message to the conclave not to have one particular faction win over the other, but a candidate of compromise and of reconciliation, which is what they were looking for with Francis. Things evolved in a slightly different way, perhaps, but that was a signal intentionally sent to those cardinals by Cardinal Sodano.
A subtle signal, but a signal nonetheless. Well, there is a lot to come over the coming days. Thank you, Massimo Faggioli, Professor of Theology at Villanova, for coming on and explaining this to us. We will have to have you back once the conclave has made its decision.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.